Hello, everyone. This is Victor Glass. I'm your host for today's webinar. Welcome to the fifth webinar in the series hosted by CRI that is aimed at documenting the effects of the pandemic on the electric utility industry and electrification in general. The title of today's webinar is How Will the Pandemic Affect Transmission and Wholesale Markets? For those who are not familiar with Rutgers Center for Research and Regulated Industries, its mission is to promote research, scholarship, and education in regulatory economics aimed at improving regulatory policy. Please visit our website. The center has been in existence for more than 40 years. It was founded by Dr. Michael Crew, who spent the bulk of his career at Rutgers Business School. I've taken over in the last 5 years. The main focus is on utility regulation, which includes electric utilities, water, gas, postal, and telecom. This webinar's basic questions fall into two sets. The first set are associated with transmission market, and the first one is how has the pandemic affected operations during the last 6 months, and specifically, how has it affected load, cost, prices, and reliability? The other question is, how do you see things playing out for the rest of the year? Do you see the need for developing new models for forecasting load, since there's been a break in historical trend in load usage? And the third question is, once the pandemic is over, are we going to see a new normal way of doing things? The second set of questions are closely related. They're directed towards power generation. And the two basic questions are, how will the pandemic affect power generation companies? And will the demand for increased reliability stimulate behind the meter generation? The experts today, and we have another outstanding group, our moderator and one of the main drivers behind this webinar series is Ahmad Faruqui. The panelists are Renuka Chatterjee, Roger Collanton, and Robert Pike. And let me describe their backgrounds, and you'll see why they're so impressive and why they can answer these rather challenging questions. Renuka Chatterjee leads MISO systems operation, overseeing day-to-day transmission reliability, generation dispatch, and real-time operations processes that ensure efficient and reliable grid operations. She is an employee of MISO since 2000, and she served in leadership positions within operations and market and transmission planning. She was instrumental in the establishment and implementation of MISO's reliability and market services. Ms. Chatterjee has led multiple high-profile initiatives, including MISO's wind integration, the development of SEAMS agreement between MISO and its neighbors, and most recently, the RTO Resource Adequacy Initiative. Ms. Chatterjee holds a doctorate degree in electrical engineering from Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago and a master's degree in electric engineering from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, India. Our next in alphabetical order panelist is Roger Collanton. Roger Collanton is a vice president, general counsel, chief compliance officer, and corporate secretary for the California ISO. Mr. Collanton serves as the chief legal officer and representative for the corporation in legal and regulatory matters and oversees all corporate compliance, governance, and internal audit functions. He also advises the Board of Governors on the application of federal, state, and local law and provides guidance and advice on governance and corporate issues. Prior to joining ISO in January 2009, Mr. Collanton was partner in the law firm of Morrison and Forrester in San Francisco. He is a member of the California Bar and has appeared in state and federal courts throughout California and the United States. He received a law degree from the University of California, Bolt Hall School of Law in 1995, and a BS degree in business administration from San Francisco State University in 1986. Prior to law school, Mr. Collanton practiced as a certified public accountant with Price Waterhouse and was a corporate controller for a privately held company. Ahmad Faruqui is our moderator. He's been working in tariff modernization since 1979 when he joined FERC and was part of a group that worked on the electric utility rate design study. He's worked on time of use rates, critical peak pricing rates, peak time rebates, and real-time pricing, and has designed and evaluated experiments to test the efficacy of these rates and testified in numerous rate cases in support and deployment of modern tariffs. In his research and consulting career, Dr. Faruqui has worked with over 150 clients around the world and has published more than 100 papers on energy topics in peer-reviewed and trade journals. His work has been cited by The Economist and other major media outlets such as Bloomberg Business Week and Forbes, and he has appeared on NPR and Fox Business News. He has provided expert testimony and appeared before commissions and presented to governments across the globe. He has taught economics at San Jose State, UC Davis, and the University of Karachi, and delivered guest lectures at a dozen other institutions, including Carnegie Mellon, Harvard, Idaho, MIT, Northwestern, Stanford, and UC Berkeley. Dr. Faruqui obtained his MA in agricultural economics and PhD in economics at UC Davis and a BA and MA in economics from the University of Karachi. Robert Pike, our panelist, is Vice President of Market Operations for the New York Independent System Operator, New York ISO. In his role, Mr. Pike is responsible for the New York ISO's installed capacity market operations, distributed resources operations, and operations performance and analysis departments. Mr. Pike's current responsibilities include administration of the installed capacity markets, execution of the market auctions, development of the resource adequacy requirements, administration of demand response, distributed energy resources and behind-the-meter net generation programs, validation, analysis, and reporting of market outcomes. Mr. Pike has worked for the NISO and its legacy organization, the New York Power Pool, for 27 years. He earned a Bachelor's of Science degree from Clarkson University in Electrical and Computer Engineering, a Master of Science from Clarkson in Electrical Engineering, and a Master of Business Administration from Union College. The format today will be panel discussions moderated by Ahmad, followed by open discussion. Please turn off your microphones and video cameras if possible, and please direct your comments to Ahmad through the chat window. With that, I will stop sharing and turn over the webinar to Ahmad.
All right. Thank you very much, Victor. I am very pleased to see that we have some regular participants in these webinars. It's so good to have some continuity. And I do apologize to them because by now they must have memorized my biography. I will abbreviate it for future renditions. We have, as you mentioned, two tracks here. The first track is on transmission market related questions, and we will take that track first. We will go through the three panelists, giving each of them roughly 10 minutes apiece. You can be a little over, a little under, but approximately speaking, that will be about a half hour of conversation. And then we will go to the second track, which is power generation. And we have two questions in that subheading, and maybe we can do 7 to 8 minutes per participant for that. We do encourage conversation through the chat box, and I will be taking a note of the issues that are coming up, and I will bring them up after the end of each track. So we will do track 1 now, and it has 3 parts. The first part, and just to remind everyone, this is about the impact of the pandemic on transmission markets, and then it'll be on generation markets. In particular, when discussing the impact of the pandemic on transmission, I want each of the 3 panelists to speak about what effect so far have you observed in your jurisdiction or service area since the pandemic began. So let's say the first 6 months of the year, maybe 7 months now, what has been the impact that you have recorded and observed? And then part B is what are you thinking will play out between now and December? And finally, we want you to give us a perspective of what the new normal is going to look like once the pandemic has abated. And of course, we don't know how long it'll take to abate. The latest numbers that came out today from Bill Gates actually were through year end, by which I mean 2021. So for planning purposes, when we are asking you the third question about the new normal, you could put it sort of halfway into the new year or into the following year. So once again, part A, what has been the impact in the first 6 months? Part B, what is the impact in the remaining months of the year? And part C, what will be the new normal like? And we are going to go alphabetically with last name. So Renuka, your turn is first, and that'll be followed by Roger, and then by Rob. So roughly 10 minutes apiece. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmad. So I represent MISO, Midwest Mid-Continent ISO. We operate the grid in over 14 states, spanning from Manitoba Hydro in the north to all the way Gulf Coast in the south. With regards to specific impacts the pandemic has had, in late March, I think that's where I'll start, because I think that's when we actually started to see some impact. In late March, as states and municipalities began issuing their orders to kind of contain the pandemic, we saw the average load drop. In fact, in March itself, in late March, we saw the load drop by about 6% year on year. So what we did in the beginning of the year, when all this started, was to freeze the model pre-COVID. So we've been running a load forecast model in parallel. By the time we got to almost in April, right, so we started to see the load drop up to 10%. In May, it got to about 11%. So that's how we kind of saw the load decrease overall. In terms of outages, and I say reliability, we care about making sure we have enough supply for the load, as well as making sure we have the wires to transmit it. In terms of transmission outages, we saw 16% of our transmission outages kind of move. So some of them moved to just before summer. So we had to get those maintenances in right before summer began, and I would say in late June. And then some of them have actually deferred their outages into fall. So we expect a challenging fall in terms of what to expect for the next 6 months. One of the things we want to make sure is all of our generator and transmission operators are able to get their necessary maintenance in. So I think that's another piece that we are watching closely in terms of outages, making sure both the generation and transmission On generation outages themselves, specifically, we had about 21 gigawatts of generation outage schedules that moved, approximately about 35 generators that moved. All of this data is available on our MISO website, so I won't necessarily share anything on the screen here. But about, with the load actually going down, generation availability wasn't a significant concern for us, at least through June. In fact, it was making sure that we had the wires to transmit it. So we were working closely to make sure we had the transmission to balance the supply and demand. Late June, I'd say early July, we had, this has been one of the hottest summers in a while. So, I mean, everyone's paying attention to what's going on in California as well. So I'll be interested as well in hearing from California. But in early July, we had some hot weather where we kind of experienced some issues as a system operator trying to make sure that we can supply the load we had, as well as make sure that we keep the system reliable. But that was not necessarily related to COVID-19. I would say it was mostly about the hot weather we saw. I think the other question was about prices. I think prices were lower than what we saw pre-COVID, but that was in large part, we believe, due to the low fuel prices. So cheaper fuel led to low energy prices, led to lower energy prices. What else? I think, what do we expect to see going forward? For me, I think the more important part, I think the pandemic has had a damping down effect on load. And it has also had an effect on the load shape change. So that is really important for us to watch, I think. In fact, we used to have a typical morning peak around 8 a.m., 9 a.m. in the morning, and then we would have an evening peak around 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock time frame. What we've seen is that with pandemic, the load peak has shifted a little. So in the morning, we get more of a flat peak that kind of starts to ramp up around 10 o'clock and then sticks until around noon. And in the evening, we are seeing a similar sticky peak. So again, not necessarily dramatically changing load forecasting models, but one of the things we are looking into is what's driving the load. One of the things we observed in hot weather situations was the damping down effect the pandemic had was all gone. And our hypothesis was that air conditioners in the homes were running, as well as air conditioners in the businesses were running, because many of the businesses kept their buildings open for employees to return to work, but not, but on a voluntary basis. So not many employees were actually going to work. So because we thought the load was much higher because of the doubling down effect of the air conditioning load. Again, we don't have enough data to kind of definitively prove that. So one thing we are working on is, what factors affect our load forecast to get it more correct. We have made some adjustments to where I think our load forecast models are able to accurately predict. So that's something to watch. I'll also say that a more agile outage coordination process. So typically spring and fall are maintenance seasons for most generation and transmission companies. So as we work to coordinate those maintenance outages, we have to make sure that the necessary maintenance is done, but at the same time, we have the necessary infrastructure to deliver load. Most of our focus, again, this doesn't necessarily tie to transmission and market prices, but most of our focus has been actually making sure that we have staff healthy to support all of the functions we have to administer, which I think all system operators face, making sure you have enough bench on the operator crew to make sure that the work gets done from a RTO perspective. Similarly, our members were concerned about making sure they had crews to actually do the maintenance without actually spreading the pandemic further. So the people aspects were our primary focus. Again, it's too soon to say if the pandemic will have any lasting effects. I think that the thermometers and the changes we have made to how we enter people into the buildings I mean, those things may have changed permanently, and maybe there is some social distancing that will stick around even further. But from a load, prices, and permanent impacts to the grid, it's too soon to tell. I read articles and keep an eye closely. There was one article about education with 100% brick and mortar, maybe hard to do going forward. If there are some permanent policy changes that stick around, that may affect the demand. So I think a lot of focus on um, load forecasting is certainly on the table. And I'll stop there and see if there are any questions or if I can turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much. That was quite insightful, and we'll certainly come back to you when the questions are on the table here. So next is Roger.
And Ahmad, I just want to make sure I'm clear. You would like me to kind of go through each of the questions under the transmission and market questions? Is that what you're thinking? You weren't segregating them out. You had them broken out on the slides by 4 or 3 separate questions. So I didn't want to ramble on if that was the case.
Would you like me to repeat the questions?
Oh, no, I have the questions,
Okay.
but I wasn't sure if you were going through each speaker and going through, you want me to address all 3 questions kind of as a whole, and that's fine. I can do that.
Yeah, if you can do all 3 in a sequence, maybe 3 minutes apiece or something.
Yeah, I will. I'll try to be succinct. But from the standpoint of the California ISO, we started kind of adapting to the pandemic really in about early March. And as we saw things unfold, we started to take measures to keep people safe within the building and, do social distancing and all those things, deep cleaning. And it was really about, obviously protecting employees and market participants, from the standpoint of closing down in-person meetings and all. And I think it's important to note, although it doesn't specifically, the nexus to transmission and markets is all about keeping our business running. So we do have 2 fully functioning control centers, and where we perform all of our operations, and we segregated people between the control centers in order to keep the operators safe. And so we had crews that were metered out between our Folsom Center and our backup center in Lincoln, California, and avoiding contact as much as we could. And I know, as Rob knows well, New York ended up with a village, I believe, for their control centers where they had set a sequestration in process. And we actually had a lot of questions about that in sequestration. And we felt comfortable from the way things were progressing here in California that we were able to manage that. And so far, we've been very successful with that. So without sequestration. So we canceled all in-person meetings, tours of the California ISO and our facilities. And we then, when the shutdown orders started coming out around the end of, maybe it was more towards the middle to end of March, we made sure that everybody, although we were already in the process of sending people home, in a very short order, we had people working from home that were able to do that, where we now have our control room operators here in the building and a handful of other people, but it's a very minimal staff of people that can only do their jobs from the facilities. In terms of reliability, frankly, the pandemic itself has not created significant impacts. We have rescheduled some planned outages, but this is utilizing existing procedures. The operators and generator operators have continued to operate and staff those facilities. So we haven't seen reliability impact related to the pandemic. Now, as Renuka noted, we have seen some reliability issues over the last few days due to extreme heat, and we have been addressing those, and that's been pretty public, but it has not been related to the pandemic or the stay-at-home orders. And in fact, and maybe this ties right into, it's interesting, Renuka, you had, it seems like a load drop much more significant than we did. Our reductions in average load were really somewhere around 2.5% to 5%, and on the weekdays, and depending on peak or non-peak. I think our load shape has remained relatively constant. I think people in the Midwest must be sleeping in more now, is what it sounds like. We need to do that.
It's all the teenagers, is
Right.
what I would say.
Well, that may be. There's large families in Indianapolis. I don't know. And we're all getting up late. But our load shape has remained relatively constant. Our average load has dropped slightly, but it started to pick up again coming into May. I think with regard to pricing, we've seen prices go down, but they're probably back up again where they were in the past. In regard to forecasting and developing new models for forecasting, again, we generally experience high demand in September and October. That's very much our peak. And we expect, and in fact, it's happened a little bit earlier this year, we expect to see this demand materialize. It has materialized. We used our ALFS, our automatic load forecasting system, and I think that provides a pretty good basis for us. So I don't know that we're in a situation where we're seeing additional forecasting models, and we're always trying to improve them and develop and grow in that regard. But from the standpoint of the pandemic, that's not creating an issue there. The new normal is probably one of the most interesting factors that's going to go across all industries, I think. The question in my mind is, are you going to, and I'm a little glib sometimes, but are you going to be able to drag people back into the office on a regular basis, day in and day out? And I think there's, with every individual, they have their own stories. Some can't wait to get out of the house. Some love being able to work in their pajamas, and not having a commute. So I do think that for many reasons, this is going to challenge the way we think about going to work every day. I think we have seen, and I've talked to some of the CEOs, other ISOs and RTOs, and talking about onboarding people and deciding, for example, that, well, instead of moving them to the host state of the ISO, that maybe they can stay where they live now, that it seems to be working. And one of the things we've seen that has been most impressive is how quickly our staff was able to ramp up and really not miss a beat in doing their daily work. And I think that it challenged in some regards some of our more traditional notions that you have to be in the building and you have to see each other. On the other hand, over the long term, for me personally, I find it a challenge. I typically will go and meet with general counsel from the other ISOs and RTOs, meet with FERC commissioners and other key players and stakeholders. And to not be able to do that in person, I find to be a challenge. So I think there's going to be a middle ground and a balance somewhere in there where maybe our work from home policies will be matured, and we'll see some people that are working from home more, some people that are, maybe hotel type of carols within the business. And I think it's, going to be very, very interesting to see how it develops.
Very good. Thank you. So Rob, you're next.
Great. Thank you, Ahmad. I guess the advantage of going last, or maybe I'll say the challenge, is to try not to repeat things that have already been said, but try to pick up on some of the things that maybe played out a little bit differently in New York or are worth echoing is to New York. For New York, really the scenario, we watched the pandemic very closely. We were following along with our planning cycles of understanding what steps we would take and the process to continue to run the business and obviously very much continue to keep the lights on. But I will say it unfolded in New York very quickly about the middle of March. And we went from business as usual on Friday to Monday at noon. Everybody was sent home to work from home, isolated the operators, and within another week after that, had moved into a sequestration of our operators, as was mentioned. And so we set up 2 camps at our control centers, and our operators lived out of RVs for almost 2 months. And it was really the middle of May before we broke sequestration. And really what had transformed over those 2 months was the infection rate in New York. And really in New York City was the most heavily hit area in Long Island, but New York in general, the infection rate was very much turned and descending. The other thing that became much more readily available was the ability to test, so that if you ran into any exposure situation, you could test and be able to isolate anybody that was necessary, as well as fellow crews. So a very rapid unfolding of events for us. The sequestration really from our perspective was all about reliability and doing everything that we could to not jeopardize any concerns, particularly with this happening and the anxiety throughout all of the citizens. Maintaining the lights on was something that just couldn't be compromised during this scenario. So moving our operators in, which was completely voluntary, there was no obligations. We sought volunteers for it and had more of our operators volunteer to step in, recognizing the responsibilities that they had than we really needed even to put on shift. So without a doubt, maintaining reliability held us throughout those first couple of months. We did do a lot of outage cancellations. Our generator community really moved very quickly into just doing the minimum actions necessary to prepare for summer. And a lot of those challenges were just getting crews and getting the outside contractors in to be able to do that work. So I think they moved quickly into that model. We did pull a lot of generation outages in June as we came back out of sequestrations and things settled in New York. People quickly did some maintenance cycles before the heat of summer moved in. I do expect that the fall is going to be a very busy outage scheduling season. A lot of work that could be postponed was, and we'll have another set of work that was scheduled for the fall timeframe. We also managed to get a nuclear refueling in the midst of all of that, which was, I'm sure, a challenging event for that facility. So really, that was our focus from an operations perspective. As Renuka mentioned, I mean, prices just collapsed in New York, but prices are driven by gas prices. And you probably can remember April, we were talking about negative prices as storage facilities around the world filled up, and that really drove prices down. We saw prices down 50% in some months from a year ago. And so far this year, we're tracking down about a third on year-over-year prices, really all driven by the lower gas prices. We did have considerably reduced load consumption. And you can imagine New York City, that is a center where people come in to work. It's certainly got a lot of residents in the suburbs, but it is a destination to come to the office. And when everybody stops coming to the office, significant implications to the city and the amount of load that we were seeing in that region. We were down, 15, 18% in New York City through early in the March, April, May timeframe. Now, loads have slowly come back across the state. Had a very hot summer, so we have come up on our load numbers considerably. But really across the state, we still see a decline. We're about 3% down across the state and 5 to 8% down in New York City on its load consumption. And that's our major load center. That represents about 40% of the total load in New York within the city. So a significant impact to New York from that load. We don't see that load coming back quickly. That's, even though we have a big uptick in the residential community and a lot more air conditioning load, it is not offsetting the commercial and industrial load. It's coming back. It's coming back slowly. But the city and life in New York City is coming back at a much slower pace than it is in the rest of the state, and concerns with moving folks back into that area. So we don't see loads back this year. We probably don't see loads coming back for a couple of years. But really, you have a full economic recovery, and the current models will suggest that it does not return to pre-pandemic levels. Now, important in New York, we actually saw a decline in loads over our 10-year horizon pre-pandemic, really driven by a growth in behind-the-meter resources, solar in particular, and a continued push in energy efficiency. So we are already on a slow decline in total load across the state, but we don't see ourselves recovering to those levels again in our current projections. And so I think when you ask the question of, what is there a new normal? Yeah, I really feel like there is a new normal. We've got a swing right now, and it will come back. But work from home for our company and for many, many companies, I think has been far more successful than we ever envisioned. Pre-pandemic, we had my department had a business continuity plan, right? And the plan was to work from home, and the expectation was we could probably hold that together for about 2 weeks. And then we would have to come up with an alternative mechanism, right? Whether we rented a hotel ballroom or something like that, that was going to happen after about 2 weeks. Well, what are we on? About 5 months now. Every business process has continued to run flawlessly. We're continuing to make forward on all of our strategic initiatives. So I think, everyone is very pleasantly surprised that work from home has gone so well. The other thing I'll comment, I think shop from home has exploded. I don't know if anybody has looked up the stock price of Amazon, FedEx, or UPS recently, but they're like gangbusters in this model. And so certain segments of the economy are doing well. And that's a convenience factor. And I do wonder, once you settle in and make that transition, do you go back quickly to go into the store, or do you just find it so convenient to sit on the couch and click and have it delivered to you in a week or two? So I think things have changed. I don't think everyone will work from home for the rest of their career. I think the social interaction, the innovative spirit that you get with the collaborating across the team, and really trying to bring new staff into the culture of an organization means we've got to get some folks back to the office eventually. But I do think we are in a different new normal going forward. And I think it's going to take some time to even get to that place. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to you, Ahmad.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Let's take a couple of questions. One of the questions is actually partly based on what you were just saying, which is looking ahead. The pandemic is behind us, but people's habits, ways of working, ways of shopping have forever changed because they have gotten used to doing a lot of things from home, like telecommuting, like not flying on business trips, but instead using Zoom like we're using now, sort of zooming in rather than flying in, and also shopping. I cannot tell you how many times I'm now seeing Amazon trucks and UPS trucks around the neighborhood. Huge boxes are being left on the doors of customers. You may have heard that Gap, the retailer, has decided to permanently close its main prime location in San Francisco, and a couple of others as well. People are just changing the way they shop. I don't think that's going to come back. This is my personal opinion, just because the pandemic is over. And I think in many ways, telecommuting is going to become the norm. So that may have implications for commercial real estate. It may also have implications for airlines. And ultimately, it may have implications for how transmission markets work. So why don't I get your comments on that? Is what I'm saying something you agree with or something you don't agree with? So let's begin with Renuka.
I agree largely, right? So I think there are habits that are going to stick around. But I will also say that the social interaction that you get and the collaboration you get from being in an office together cannot be replaced by the video calls. I mean, even with everyone turning on their video, we don't require our staff, for example, to turn on their video, but everybody does, just so we get some facial expressions and interactions going. The one thing that we've been talking about seriously is, I mean, could companies go back to like permanently working from home? And I know some companies have made the announcement to actually say, oh, we don't need the office space, we can just work from home. But I do think that there's got to be some collaboration, some physical interaction in terms of making sure strategy discussions or brainstorming is hard over the video. So I do think that we won't completely swing the pendulum completely the other way. Even with shopping, you know, a lot of us are seeing even groceries being delivered online. But I think at the end of the day, there is, again, I'm no psychology expert. Human behavior requires some social interaction. So I don't think we'll swing the other way. Some of this may be temporary. So some of it will come back. And I keep reading articles about the influenza that happened about a decade ago, right? So in 1918. So they were social distancing. There was similar shutdowns of all sorts, but I think it's slow. Like Rob mentioned, I think the people will move slowly to go back to normal, and it won't be completely the old normal. Well, but that said, I would agree that people may not fly as much, or you know, maybe airlines won't cram us in so few seats. That would actually be a nice thing. So yeah, I agree generally.
So not quite as extreme as I was laying out, but something in between.
Yeah.
You would agree that the old normal will not be equal to the new normal, that there will be some mutation of commuting, socializing, and shopping that will manifest itself. Okay, so Roger.
Interesting. I like that. The old normal will not be equal to the new normal, and I think that's probably true no matter what. And it's an interesting analogy. And when you think about Renuka, when you were saying that, when I was thinking about 1918, fortunately I wasn't there, but the 1918 versus today, we have the technology to keep the world running and to do so much that we don't have to be in the same building and right next to each other in a lot of ways. So it comes down to, in my mind, it comes down to, again, not like you, Renuka, not an expert in human behavior by any means, but that I think that we're finding things that will be a hybrid type of new normal. Meetings, for example, we are actually having less meetings than we used to have because it was so easy to just get into a meeting and suddenly you spend half your day in a meeting and you get to the end of the day and you're thinking of the to-do list that you had and you've barely checked anything off. So I think you end up becoming more efficient in those regards. I think the flexibility of being able to, I was talking to Victor a little bit right before we started, and I was saying that there's something really nice, and I say colloquially that you roll out of bed, you get on your computer, you work for a couple hours, and then you jump in the shower, and then you run an errand or whatever it might be. And I think there's a lot of people that especially that have the ability and have the space at home that really enjoy doing that. And so, but with that, there's all the other benefits that I completely agree with. Getting in the office, I miss having my staff and being able to walk around and just talk to them off the cuff and say, what are you doing today? What's going on? What's happening with this issue or that issue? And so, you do miss that, and you do miss the interaction. So I really believe, I mean, it's probably going to be industry by industry. There are some industries that will probably never feel the need to go back into the office. But I think generally you'll find a loosening of work from home policies. I think you'll find a hybrid where people are now realizing we can be as efficient and effective from home. But over the long term, we're going to have to see what that looks like. And you are going to have those touch points and those interactions, and whether it's on a daily basis or 3 days a week or a couple of hours during the day. it's going to challenge it. It's actually, when you bring it back to the purpose of this seminar here, it's going to challenge our notions of where the load comes from when we're commuting, when we're charging our vehicles, when we're using our air conditioners, whether we're air conditioning our offices or our homes. So I don't know the answer. If I did, boy, I'd be retired tomorrow. But I think that there is definitely going to be some significant changes that are going to develop along the lines of, again, when technology develops and you see, these big changes in people's work patterns and their lifestyles.
Those are great points. And I'll just make a personal comment here. For 5 years, I worked at a company in Oakland, California, which didn't have a room for me. There was no office space. So I worked from home, but I would go into the office twice a week, sit in a conference room and meet with, my partners and my staff. So it was sort of like a hybrid. This was way before the pandemic arrived, but I'm imagining that something like that could become part of the future. I mean, ultimately, I think we are all anxious to reconnect with our peers, whether personally speaking or at work. I mean, as Aristotle said, man is a social animal, and that has not changed, even though millennia have elapsed. The problem is right now we are socially distancing ourselves, so we're doing the opposite of what we have an innate desire to do. And anyway, not to ramble on, Rob, do you want to add some closing comments on that question? Then I'll bring up the second one.
I think it's very much going to be an industry-specific challenge, and things are going to evolve for different industries. I have a friend who runs a call center for a service industry, and they've all moved home, right? They don't have that same level of interaction even when they're in the office that Roger mentioned. And so for something like that, he's very much questioning why he's renting real estate to have all of these folks in when they have been just as effective at a remote location. I think Renuka mentioned something that I think is interesting and hadn't crossed my mind yet. We think about these office buildings, and they're probably not fully consuming load right now because they're mostly empty. But when they're 20% full, are they almost at full load because of all of the air handling, electronics, and environmental controls? So you've still got a lot of air conditioning load at home for the 80% of folks that haven't come in the office, but you've now actually picked up commercial load, not necessarily consistent with the population. And it's a really interesting question about what may play out as some parts of the industry come back before others do.
Ahmad, if I could add one more thing. As I was listening to everyone, I was thinking our business has a lot of physical and cybersecurity to factor into, right? The energy industry does, and there are many other industries as such. When all this started, there was discussion about a ghost operator or operating from home or a third location. And we didn't pursue any of it because of this physical and cybersecurity risks associated with something like that. So businesses that have such fears, again, at work, when I use my laptop, there's a team of Windows professionals protecting the network. When I'm home, I'm on my internet. So I think there are risks to consider. So there is probably more to be said around industries that have physical and cyber regulations to be more in the office.
Thank you. So there is a long trail in the chat box that we cannot do justice to. But let me say that an issue has come up in the context of the California load shedding activities, which of course are not triggered by the pandemic. They're triggered by fires and lightning strikes and all kinds of issues. But I believe there is an overriding question that is implicit in the chat box, which is if you do encounter in your footprint a situation where there's a shortage of supply relative to forecast demand, then is load shedding the best way to deal with it, along with flex alerts and appeals for conservation, something that California did 20 years ago when the energy crisis happened? Or are there better ways now, digitally enabled technology, prices being sent to devices, giving customers a choice to turn off certain loads by leaving others on, as opposed to blanket just cutting people off and leaving them in the darkness when the climate is really hot outside. You cannot go to a shopping mall or to a restaurant. You just have to sweat it out. That's sort of a blunt question, and unfortunately, since it has been occasioned by the California market, so I'll let Roger make a comment or two, and then I want the other two panelists to sort of imagine a similar draconian scene descending on them in some hypothetical future. Think of it as a Matt Damon movie, and you are Matt Damon, if I can use that metaphor. How would you deal with that awkward situation? So let's begin with Roger.
Well, the Matt Damon movies I know of, he probably would have killed somebody. So I will, I'll try not to go with that. I'm not here to talk about the outages that happened over the weekend. There were 3 days of rolling blackouts, and our CEO has issued press releases and had press statements on that, and so I'll leave those statements to themselves. I will say, however, that they were not due to fire and other things. They were due to shortage in supply, and when there is a load shed, it is a decision of last resort with very little time to protect the system from cascading outages. And so this wasn't an idea, a situation where anyone in the control room is saying, well, we could send a signal, we could do this, we could do that. We had no other choice. But again, I say that with the caveat that I'm not the VP of operations, I'm not the CEO, and I'm not the one that's making those decisions. And the last thing I will say is that there was, some public communication between the state of California governor's office and the California ISO, the Public Utilities Commission, and the California Energy Commission. And we have committed with those agencies and us as the independent system operator to have a root cause analysis on these issues.
Start again, Ahmad. You were on mute.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I thought maybe my network had dropped. I wasn't sure which network. So, okay, so Mike, I was just going to ask Renuka, if something like that was to suddenly develop in your footprint, what approach would you favor? Rotating outages, appealing to customers, or having price responsive demand, or something else?
It's not an easy thing to imagine. And again, that doesn't mean we are not faced with that choice. I think it really depends on how far in advance we know and what tools we have at our disposal, right? So I'll give you the system operations perspective. No operator, nobody on my team actually wants to or likes to get into a load shed, right? So we will do everything we can to prevent. But that said, you're just faced in certain system conditions where it's inevitable, right? So if you have less than 30 minutes notice and suddenly you lost enough generation, there's just nothing you could do. So again, I think while there are discussions on price sensitive demand, where to the point where you're talking about, app-based pricing where customers can choose to be a little bit hotter by 2 degrees in their home, they won't know the difference. There are discussions of that, but knowing the response for that, right? So you have to put a price out sufficiently in advance so the customers can actually respond and reduce the load. So we have to always think about for the time for the market to react when you print high prices, or the time for the load to respond when you're printing demand sensitive prices. So I think that's important to make sure what kind of tools you have in front of you. Again, sufficiency concerns versus transmission related reliability concerns are different. I was a young engineer when we went through the Northeast blackout of 2003, right? And I remember during that time, there was no time. Things went quickly out of control. So again, the point being, I think if you know far enough in advance and you're able to incent generation to come back from outage, for example, things like that can happen. But there are certain situations that it is inevitable. Load shed is inevitable. It's not anybody's favorite tool, and we hate to use it. But when it comes to reliability and maintaining the system integrity, if we have to, we will. I think we don't fully appreciate the time for the market to react or the time for the demand to react. How long will it take if we print that price sensitive demand price? I mean, if I put in $5 out, what will you actually get? The experiments and the theory haven't been fully conducted and fleshed out. We are yet to learn some of that with the advent of distributed energy resources.
So I mentioned this very quickly. I was at a conference on price responsive demand 11 years ago. One of the ISOs had organized it, not one of the three here. And the CEO was there too. I knew him well. So I asked him on the sidelines, so are you excited about price responsive demand? He said, no. I said, but you organized the conference. The theme is price responsive demand. He said, my job is to keep the lights on. I cannot trust the customer will respond. I said, but you can trust the economy to respond. You can trust the weather to respond. Neither of those two you can control. At least with price responsive demand, you have a chance. Well, at some point, the conversation ended because I couldn't find closure with him. There continues to be that debate. 11 years have come and gone. Rob, do you want to add some comments from the New York perspective?
I find it ironic that you're asking the questions about should we have price responsive load. I mean, obviously, to the comments that both have made, I mean, shedding load is an absolute last resort decision, and you've got to go through every other tool in the toolbox before you get there. And if you've got the time, you're bringing resources on. We would be activating our emergency demand response programs. We would be doing voluntary appeals. We would be emergency purchases. I'm sure all the things that went through the California operators' thoughts as well. But when you get to the last resort, is where you have to go to protect the grid and protect a larger problem from occurring. One of the evolutions that we are trying to make within our markets is the incorporation of distributed energy resources. And so we've recently filed and had accepted provisions for DER participation, whether that's demand response, behind the meter generation, load control, building automation, whatever you can put together to bring a service back to the grid. And that's really been, as you well know, that's a missing element of the markets that really has struggled to develop and become a big player in the marketplace. And so we are hopeful that with that program and its integration right into our real-time energy markets with a price-sensitive signal associated with it, with full participation rights for all of those types of resources, we can start to develop that response into the marketplace.
Thank you very much. So let's turn to the generation side of the conversation, which Rob already has touched upon. We have two specific questions that we would like you to address. The first one is, what do you see as being the impact of the pandemic on power generation companies? Do you see them wanting to produce more generation, for example, or less generation in years to come? And number two is the issue of behind the meter generation. To what extent do you think reliability, the cause of reliability, will be better served by having more behind the meter generation? And I'll just add a little footnote there. It's very clear in California that behind the meter generation is really taking off, and also in Hawaii. So there are certain parts of the US where behind the meter generation was already happening even before the pandemic. The question is, as a result of the pandemic and people becoming more concerned about reliability, and particularly in light of the outages that we are seeing in California, which, by the way, have been noticed not just in California or the US, but I have been talking to people in Hong Kong and New Zealand and Europe. They're all paying a lot of attention to what California is doing. And so just about everyone I have spoken with is saying this is going to give a big boost to DERs, behind the meter generation. So those are our generation related questions. Feel free to emphasize one or the other. And let's say We take about 6 minutes per panelist, and beginning with you, Renuka.
Thank you, Ahmad. With regards to power generation companies, again, we talked about how a lot is not still unknown about how much the load will be depressed going forward. And what happens to fuel prices. So one of the things I think about is if the gas prices remain so low, at that point, does traditional generation start competing with renewable resources like wind and solar, which are practically zero fuel cost? I mean, things to think about in that nature, but again, a lot is yet to be unknown. In my mind, there'll be some impact to where, you will have to think about if the demand is going to be depressed, at least in portions of the country, what does it do to the power generation business? You talked about the behind the meter generation for increased reliability. Again, the trend in behind the meter generation and consumer invested, microgrid type neighborhoods will largely be driven by economies of the states and jurisdictions, right? So in states where, people are still looking for jobs, etc., I don't know that they're investing in rooftop solar. So I think the effect on the economy will play a lot into whether behind the meter generation will really take off. I don't know that the decisions about increased reliability will drive the behind the meter generation. So again, a lot is yet to, an individual consumer is not investing in behind the meter generation directly because they think it's more reliable. In fact, they lose their little diesel generator or their little wind farm in the backyard, they need power. So the interconnected power system provides that backup for them. If I don't know that they will, the drive for the pandemic at least isn't going to drive a significant change in the reliability patterns, but that's just my opinion.
Thank you. Let's go next to Roger.
I'd have to only guess what the effect would be on generation and generators. And I can tell you that we haven't seen adverse effects on generators. We've had, I've been on some phone calls, especially in the heat of things in March and in April, where there was discussion of whether some of the online some of the generators sequester their control rooms, or how they operate, or what happens if we start seeing COVID-19 kind of run through the generation community, and it didn't materialize. And so I could imagine in that situation, the pandemic could cause some significant problems. We did not see that materialize. From the standpoint of behind the meter generation in California, as you observe, Ahmad, that we've seen incredible growth in behind the meter generation. And I believe the estimates are over the next few years that behind the meter energy production could equal over half of our needs in California, or at least in the ISO system, at least on some operating days. But that's really a function of state policy, utility programs, customer choice, I suppose, and tons and tons of technical terms. There are tons and tons of solar and rooftop solar are driven by the net metering programs here in California, and frankly the cost of the utility bills. But that creates its own issues with the afternoon ramp and solar coming off the system. So it's an issue that is going to be part of the larger discussion of the resource mix. And what that resource mix means for reliability. And can you manage that without traditional types of power plants?
If I can just ask a very quick question, since you mentioned the uptake of solar in California and the issues and challenges it creates. Some people are suggesting that solar has to be paired with batteries to prevent the kind of issues you're talking about. Do you see batteries or storage capability in conjunction with behind the meter generation improving the outlook for reliability?
Well, not being the engineer in the group, but what I've seen and heard is that all different types of storage, whether it's pumped hydro, battery storage, that if you want to harness the tremendous capabilities we have in solar and that can only increase, you have situations that, our peak periods are changing and our peak generation periods are changing. And when you have lots of solar that you can't use, you have to either export it or you have to try to figure out ways to store it. So I think that makes sense. And I do think there's going to be a lot of room for advancing technology in that area. Again, whether it's batteries, whether it's utilization, again, batteries, but a utilization of electric vehicles, whether it's pump storage or other types of methods of storage. You're muted.
Great capability at some point.
I'm sorry.
Some people have incredible scenarios where everyone has an electric car 10 years out, or half of them have it, and they have 80 kilowatt hour capability in an electric car battery, which they're willing to sell to the grid during times of shortages. Is that Pollyannic, or is that within the realm of feasibility from the ISO's perspective?
I can't speak to that. I could only give you my own, probably skewed opinion on that, and an opinion may be, just more actually speculation. I feel like in parts of the country, it's very difficult to get people out of their internal combustion engines, and I think unless and until the network, which is happening, is built out throughout the country where people can get in the car and drive from San Francisco to LA, even though they may only do that once every 6 months or once a year. I think there's this tendency to think, well, I need to be able to do that. I need to be able to get in my car and go somewhere and stop and fill up in 30 seconds or a minute or two and then keep going. So as that infrastructure builds out, and the more it builds out, the more it's going to provide those opportunities. But then if you start talking about, well, you're going to charge your battery at a certain time and you're going to discharge it in order to support the grid, that all depends and comes back maybe to our new norm and how people's work patterns are. And are they driving at that period of time? Do they need their battery? Are they able to let it sit? Those are going to be some significant technological challenges going forward. Is it feasible? I think it probably is. And I think there's a lot of technologies that are feasible that can really help support electrical storage.
Excellent. Thank you. Rob?
Thank you. Yeah, I think the specific impact of the pandemic on power generation companies really was maybe limited to the early days of the transition in. We did a lot of coordination with them, with the different fleet owners and operators, really just to keep our eye on the reliability question. Were any of them going to have any problems operating, whether that was fuel maintenance operators, whatever the situation might be. And there was a lot of coordination. Some operators chose to sequester their crews. Some chose to train additional crews so they'd have additional layers of backup if they needed to work through crews if some of them became sick. But that all has kind of played out. The infection rates have come down in New York, and people have moved beyond that stage of operation and really moved more to the testing and social distancing in order to manage that particular concern. I mean, I think the bigger implication in New York is really the transition and the public policy of the state government to move to a fleet that is much more renewable, that is emission-free, carbon-free generation sources. That's the significant focus of ourselves in trying to make sure reliability isn't jeopardized, the ability of these resources to operate and maximize their output to generate electricity and meet load is captured, and look at what we need in order to maintain reliability on the system. And that's whether that's the ability to access additional generation if it's needed, or additional services, or to manage demand if that becomes the flexible resource. But those are really our primary focuses right now on the generation side, is as we transition to a 70% renewable by 2030. That's kind of our first milestone in New York. is what does the fleet makeup need to look like? What are the key services that we have to be able to receive from the fleet of resources, whatever it is? And really, our primary focus right now is flexibility in that fleet, the ability to respond to balance for known ramp events of the sun coming up and the sun coming down, as well as unexpected events that may happen with storms or thunderstorms, high wind events, snow on the solar panels, right? Whatever those events are going to be, what and over what different time scales do we need to be able to have the full complement of resources to keep the lights on?
So you mentioned load flexibility or flexibility in the broad sense of the term for the grid to keep dynamically demand and supply in balance. If you focus for a moment just on load flexibility, what kinds of things do you think will contribute to having load flexibility? For example, storage is mentioned, solar is mentioned, smart thermostats are mentioned, digital appliances in the home are mentioned by some people, and of course, electric cars. Is it those kinds of things that you think would be desirable to have from a load flexibility perspective, or are there certain other things in mind as well?
All the above, and whatever someone can innovate as a solution for us. You know, one of the things that we've approached the DER model with is, you know, you projected the example of, you know, electric vehicles wanting to sell into the grid. What we want to steer away from is predefining what the technologies are that can do that, and define what the services are that we're looking for. And more importantly, we want to make sure there's a model for an aggregation facility or an option. So, you know, each of these resources isn't looking to come to the ISO, but they're looking to come through an aggregator that might be able to bundle multiple different technologies together and services together to be able to bring us the services that were needed. The challenge we really faced is if we start to build market rules that hinge on the particular technology, one, we're going to stifle innovation from happening. Two, we'll never be able to keep up with that innovation, right? As the technology evolves and the new system comes on board, do we now need to go rebuild all of our participation rules because a new technology has come on board? Let's extract ourselves from that level of definition, build out the services that we're looking for, and find a way to schedule it and measure it and confirm it's there.
Okay, great. Thank you. So there are some audience questions. One question is, I think it was prompted by Roger's remark. It's California specific, but let's take it in the broad sense of the term. The person is asking, will behind the meter solar be able to reach half of your operating area's needs in the next 10 years? Or is that like significantly unrealistic projection? Do you see such a big role being played by behind the meter solar as opposed to front of the meter solar? So let's begin with Renuka. What's the outlook for behind the meter solar in MISO? Is it huge or is it not huge 10 years out?
So behind the meter, again, you know, we're starting to see some, we have some now behind the meter. It's not significant enough. And even utility scale solar is much, much smaller in the MISO footprint. As we look into 10 years, we expect it to grow some, but not at the significant enough pace that at least I'm reading in the chat box around California. Part of it is some of the state policies and, you know, economies of the state where they are. And, you know, interestingly enough, our first utility scale solar was actually in the north. But, you know, and it came online in December for 6 months almost. We didn't quite see enough. We saw very little output from it because of the cloud cover, etc. So again, we are not seeing dramatic. Again, there's no way to actually explicitly track for us on how much will be behind the meter, right? So we're talking about distributed energy resources and what kind of communication rules we want to have with them. But I expect the pace of adoption will be a little bit slower and actually be different. We cover 14 states. So the rate of adoption will be different in each state. So we're trying to make sure we meet the needs of the customers across those states.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Roger, do you have any further comments on the likely share of resources that will be coming from behind the meter solar in California?
Well, whether it's half or some other amount, I think it's, especially under current state policy, and add to that federal tax credits, I think it's certainly going to continue to grow at a rapid pace. And beyond that, I can't predict.
Rob, New York. I mean, one secret that somebody has told me behind California's success with solar is high electric prices. So areas with high electric prices like Hawaii and Australia are world leaders in solar. Areas with low electric prices, why would anybody bother with solar if you can buy your power at 10 cents a kilowatt hour from the grid? Now, New York, I understand, is a mixture, with some areas being quite expensive and others being less expensive. So are you seeing much solar movements taking place?
Seeing considerable solar growth and behind the meter solar in New York. We're at about 2,000 megawatts behind the meter currently. State policy is to get to 6,000 by 2025. So we see considerable amounts of solar, most of it coming in behind the meter. In the 2,000 megawatts that currently is in New York, about 30 is actually a direct wholesale market participant. And I really see that trend continuing. That is going to be behind the meter solar. I think some fairly large installations will be coming into play. So it's not just all rooftop solar, but I think it will still be mostly behind the meter that will enter into the New York markets.
Okay, great. There was a question, I can't seem to find it now. There are so many questions, actually. This is probably the most creative chat box we've had in all these webinars. One of the questions was, in light of behind the meter generation rising at a rapid pace, perhaps paired with storage and load shapes changing and generation shapes changing, the duck curve phenomena, in other words, is it appropriate, therefore, to begin changing rate design? And I realize that you folks are experts in wholesale markets as opposed to retail markets, but obviously the two are interconnected, and I'm sure you have conversations with your stakeholders in which utilities and other retail providers are involved. So the question is, has the time come to change the definition of what is meant by peak period? It used to be noon to 6, for example, in California. Then it became 2 to 7, and now it's 4 to 9. That's the peak period. Do you see similar phenomena taking place in your jurisdictions? And I should tell you, I, as a customer who has solar, who has a battery, who has an electric car, I'm sort of at the bleeding edge, so to speak, and I'm living through this giant experiment. My wife and I are empty nesters in this house, and she doesn't like any of this. And she's saying, are you behind this? Is this what your career is about? And so we have some interesting conversations. When the big crisis happened with the blackouts, my older daughter, who's a lawyer, said, Dad, I thought that's what you did. Can't you fix this crisis? So impossible expectations exist in the neighborhood. Leaving that aside, let's begin with this panel. This is the last question. Do you see the need to respond to the duck curve phenomena by changing the definition of what peak means? And is your peak period going to land smack on the customer's dinner hour?
So, in MISO, we talk about what's called all hours matter. And it comes largely from our experience that our last few emergencies we have had to deal with, and I say emergencies because in MISO footprint, we have to declare an emergency to access our demand response, or what we call load modifying resources. The reason we use that all hours matter is because most of those events were actually in the morning peak and actually were not in summer. we have not actually had a significant event in summer in a while. Most of our events are in actually spring and fall, and that too, many of them in the morning peak. So again, I think peak is a subjective term. It's about resource availability and need, and what we are learning. I think the biggest thing I'll say is assuming that if you're sufficient for peak, you're good for the rest of the day is not a good assumption. I think we need to start building processes where all hours matter, and we need to focus on resource availability and the need. Again, we are fuel neutral. Be it demand or be it wind or be it coal or nuclear. From a system operator perspective, we are fuel neutral. We really care about, are you going to be there when I need you, and how much are you going to produce, right? So that's what we need to know so we can actually keep the lights on. So yeah, we cannot base our studies based on a peak hour, which I think is a drawback we are all learning.
Thank you. Roger?
I think you described our shift in peak hours. And so that is what we're seeing as I think one of our former VPs named it the duck curve. And but to that point, and to Renuka's point, I mean, we obviously need to be aware of all hours, but we need to be aware of when the solar comes on and when it ramps and when the evening ramp is. And again, repeating what I said earlier, as work patterns change, as the new norm comes into place, we're going to have to keep an eye on what that does to the peak load. So whether we redefine it, whether we call it a peak load or not, I don't know if that matters or if that's just semantics, but we certainly need to be looking at what's happening on those hours and what our generation mix is on any given hour and during those ramps.
So in a sense, it's not clear what peak means anymore. I'm getting that impression. So I know we are down to the last 2 minutes. Rob, you get all of those.
So we already see, even with only 2,000 megawatts of behind the meter solar, that our peaks are shifting 1, 2, 3 hours into the evening. And so we see that happening now from gross versus net load. We are modifying the rules to focus interest in the peak load hours. So we call it a peak load window. And it's really focused around resources that have limited abilities to operate, whether that be storage resources. So we want to incentivize them to be across a certain subset of hours rather than all 24 hours of the day, and intermittent resources or renewable resources, and what hours do we need to be looking at their contribution. And that has shifted. In our most recent analysis, it has shifted later into the evening for that peak load window concern. And it will continue to be reviewed and revised and shifted as necessary as the load profile shifts, as the net load profile shifts. We're still very much driven by a summer peaking concern, but all the concerns that Renuka and Roger mentioned are now part of our studies and now part of the investigations that we do to say, do we have concerns in April? We expect to be winter peaking in probably 12 to 15 years with all of the electrification that is anticipated in New York. That's a fundamental shift for the New York market to move in that direction. So we continue to watch all of those elements within our reliability analyses and question when is that shift going to occur in New York, and what modifications are necessary so that all the incentives are aligned with the operational needs.
So when this electrification future has arrived, let's make sure the power stays on, because there'll be no natural gas as a backup. There'll be no gasoline powered car in the garage, and it'll be complete darkness at noon if power goes out and we are totally electrified. On that positive note, I'll turn it back to Victor.
Thanks very much, Ahmad. And thank you, our panelists. You did a wonderful job. Just to be a quick summary, one of the really important messages that came out of this discussion, which reinforced previous discussions, is that operations were basically unaffected by the pandemic, that employees at the electric utility companies, the ISOs, they stepped up and kept the power going. And that's a wonderful story that seems to be underplayed. The second point is that although there was a decline in demand, it's very clear to me that there were very big regional differences that point out that strategies in one part of the country may not be useful in another part. For example, New York City has lost a tremendous amount of load because of the pandemic, whereas in other parts of the country, I think I saw that Texas demand might have actually been going up. A third message is that reliability is becoming more and more important of an issue, and there's a lot of opportunity there for technological change, batteries, other ways of using electric vehicles. So this is an area that is probably very fertile for new concepts. And finally, coming from the telecom industry and listening to Renuka about the delay between pricing and customer reaction, my response is that one of the ways to cut down customer delay is to have a better communication system, have have a smart network, have appliances automatically communicating to the grid, and if you did that, then pricing becomes a very useful way of saving resources instead of having to have extra capacity. Anyway, that's just my telecom background. In any case, again, thank you so much for putting on this webinar and relaying the wisdom and answering the questions that we asked. And from there, Ahmad, I think we should stop and hope to see you all again. Probably have a follow-up sometime. Take care.